19-year-old Lumina Kensington stood before the altar, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped her bouquet. Beside her stood a man 40 years her senior, a duke known only for his recluse nature and a face scarred by wars long forgotten. The congregation whispered that she was a gold digger, a girl selling her youth for a title. Lumina wept behind her veil, believing her life was effectively over, that she was being sold into a prison of servitude. But the whispers were wrong. When the heavy oak doors of the bridal chamber closed that night, the Duke did not reach for her dress. He reached for a small iron key. What happened next wasn't a tragedy, but a shocking twist that would rewrite the fate of one of England's most powerful families. This is the story of the wedding gift that changed everything. Rain lashed against the single-pane windows of the Kensington townhouse in Bloomsbury, hattling the glass in its frame. Inside, the air smelled of stale tea and creeping damp. It was the scent of poverty, trying desperately to disguise itself as genteel decline. Lumina Kensington sat on the edge of the velvet chaise, her posture rigid. She was 19, with hair the color of roasted chestnuts and eyes that usually held a spark of defiance. Today, however, those eyes were dull, fixed on the man pacing before the fireplace. Lord Percival Vane paused, inspecting a chip in the porcelain figure on the mantelpiece with a sneer. He was a man of 40, soft in the middle, but sharp in the eyes, possessing the predatory patience of a spider. "The mathematics are quite simple, Mrs. Kensington," Vane said, turning his gaze not to Lumina, but to her mother, Beatrice, who sat weeping into a lace handkerchief. "Your late husband, God rest his chaotic soul, left debts totaling £12,000. I hold the notes, all of them." Beatrice let out a fresh sob. "Arthur always believed the next investment would save us. He didn't mean to leave us destitute." "Intentions do not pay the butcher, madam," Vane snapped. He walked over to Lumina, invading her personal space. The smell of his cologne musk and overly sweet lavender made her stomach turn. "However, I am a reasonable man. I have a proposition." Lumina looked up, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Stated clearly, my lord, we have no patience for riddles today." Vane smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Feisty. I like that. The proposal is this: you, Miss Lumina, will marry, and you will marry well. The dowry provided by the groom will settle the debt, and I will tear up the notes." "And who?" Lumina asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Is the groom?" "Me," Vane said softly. Lumina recoiled, as if slapped. You were my father's contemporary. You are—" "Solvent," Vane interrupted. "Rich, and willing to overlook your lack of status." "I would rather starve," Lumina hissed. Vane chuckled darkly. "I thought you might say that. Which brings me to the alternative. There is another interested party, a man who has been looking for a wife of specific breeding. A Kensington fits the bill." He pulled a folded letter from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the low table. It landed with a heavy thud, as if the paper itself carried the weight of a tombstone. His Grace Archibald Weatherby, the Duke of Harrogate. The room went silent. Even Beatrice stopped crying to gasp. "The Mad Duke," Beatrice whispered, clutching her throat. "But he must be 70 if he is a day. They say he lives in a fortress in Yorkshire and hasn't been seen in London society for a decade. They say he burned down his own guest wing in a fit of rage. He is 72, Vane corrected indifferently, and he is indeed dying. He requires a duchess to manage his affairs in his final months, and presumably to provide him with companionship." He wrote to his solicitors, requesting a young woman of good health and no fortune. He offers to pay off all Kensington debts in exchange for your hand. Lumina stared at the letter. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It was a bill of sale. "And if I refuse both?" Lumina asked. "Then I foreclose on this house tomorrow," Vane said, checking his pocket watch. "Your mother goes to the poorhouse. You, my dear, will likely end up in a workhouse or perhaps walking the streets of Whitechapel. The choice is yours. Be an old man's nursemaid. Be my wife or be a beggar." Lumina looked at her mother. Beatrice was frail, her health declining rapidly since Arthur's death. The poorhouse would kill her within a month. "I will not marry you, Lord Vane," Lumina said, standing up. She smoothed the wrinkles of her faded grey dress. "I will marry the Duke." Vane looked almost disappointed. He shrugged. "A pity. I would have enjoyed breaking you in. But Harrogate has deeper pockets. Pack your bags, Miss Kensington. The carriage for Yorkshire leaves at dawn." The journey to Yorkshire took 3 days of grueling travel. As the landscape shifted from the soot-stained bricks of London to the wild rolling moors of the North, Lumina felt a profound sense of isolation. The sky here was a bruised purple, vast and indifferent. When the carriage finally pulled through the rusted iron gates of Harrogate Manor, Lumina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The estate was massive, a sprawling Gothic beast of dark stone, with ivy choking the turrets and gargoyles that seemed to leer down at the approaching horses. She was ushered inside by a stern housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, a woman with a face carved from granite, who offered no smile, only a critical once-over. "His Grace is in the library," Mrs. Gable said. "Do not tire him. He has had a difficult week." Lumina was led down a long, drafty corridor lined with portraits of ancestors, who all seemed to share the same hooked nose and arrogant sneer. Mrs. Gable opened a heavy mahogany door and stepped aside. The library was dim-lit only by the dying embers of a fire and a single oil lamp on a desk cluttered with maps and legal documents. The air smelled of old paper medicinal brandy and dust. "Come closer, girl. I'm not going to bite you. I haven't the teeth for it." The voice was raspy, dry as dead leaves. Lumina stepped forward, her shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. Sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair was the Duke. Archibald Weatherby was a ruin of a man. His skin was parchment thin and pale, stretched over sharp cheekbones. A jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jawline, pulling his left eye into a permanent squint. He sat wrapped in a heavy tartan blanket, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the armrests. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who was already half ghost. "Lumina Kensington," he rasped, looking her up and down. His gaze was sharp, intelligent, and surprisingly devoid of lust. It felt more like he was appraising a horse at an auction. "You are younger than I remember your grandmother being." Lumina blinked, taken aback. "You knew my grandmother?" "Your Grace." "Everyone knew Eleanor," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. "But that is ancient history. You know why you are here." "To settle my father's debts," Lumina said, her voice trembling slightly, but her chin held high. "And to be your wife." "To be my Duchess," he corrected sharply. "There is a difference. Do you understand the duties?" "I assume. Nursing, managing the household," Lumina ventured. Archibald let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. He reached for a glass of water, and Lumina instinctively stepped forward to help him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I have nurses. I have servants. I do not need you to empty my chamber pot, girl." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the scar on his face. "I need you to wear my ring. I need you to sign your name on the register. And I need you to endure the absolute hatred of my family when they realize I have married a pauper instead of leaving my fortune to them." Lumina froze. "Your family, my nephew Rupert, and his screeching wife Catherine." Archibald spat the names out like poison. "Vultures, the lot of them. They are waiting for me to die so they can strip this house to the studs. But a widow complicates things. A widow has rights." He looked at her with a sudden fierce intensity. "This is a business arrangement, Miss Kensington. You give me the satisfaction of seeing the look on Rupert's face when he realizes he isn't the sole heir, and I give you security. Is that understood? And the marriage bed?" Lumina asked, her face burning. It was the question that had haunted her every mile of the journey north. The Duke looked at her, and for a second his expression softened into something almost sad. "You are 19. You have dreams, I suppose. A young man back in London, perhaps." "No young man," Lumina said softly. "But dreams. Yes, I wanted to study botany, to paint the flora of the Americas." Archibald leaned back, closing his eyes. "Botany. A noble pursuit. Better than gambling like your father." He opened his eyes again. The softness was gone. "Go to your room. The wedding is in 2 days. It will be small. It will be cold. And then you will be the Duchess of Harrogate. Do not expect kindness from me, Lumina. I have none left to give. I used it all up years ago." Lumina curtsied, her heart heavy as lead. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "And Lumina, yes, Your Grace, lock your door tonight. My nephew Rupert arrived an hour ago. He knows why you are here, and he is not a man who loses gracefully." Lumina fled the room, the heavy door booming shut behind her. As she hurried down the dark corridor toward the guest wing, she realized she hadn't just sold herself to an old man. She had walked willingly into a war zone. Lumina did not sleep that first night. The wind howled around Harrogate Manor, sounding like lost souls begging for entry. She had locked her door as instructed, pushing a heavy oak chair against it for good measure. Every creak of the ancient floorboards outside her room made her breath catch in her throat. The next morning, the storm had subsided into a sullen grey drizzle. Lumina, dressed in the least frayed gown she owned, a high-collared navy wool, and descended the grand staircase. The house felt immense and oppressively silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall that sounded like a slow heartbeat. She was directed by a silent footman to the breakfast parlour. It was a cheerful room, painted pale yellow, entirely at odds with the occupants sitting at the table. Mrs. Gable had mentioned Rupert, but she hadn't mentioned his wife. Rupert Weatherby was perhaps 35, with the same sharp cheekbones as his uncle, but none of the weary intelligence in his eyes. He was handsome in a slick, fox-like way, dressed in an impeccably tailored riding suit. Beside him sat Catherine, a woman whose pinched expression suggested she was permanently smelling something unpleasant. They stopped talking the moment Lumina entered. Rupert did not stand. "Ah," Rupert said, slicing into a sausage with unnecessary violence. "The sacrificial lamb arrives. Tell me, Miss Kensington, how much did Uncle Archie pay for you? I'm trying to keep the accounts balanced, you see." Lumina stopped by the sideboard, her knuckles whitening as she gripped a saucer. "Good morning to you as well, Mr. Weatherby. The arrangement between His Grace and myself is private." Catherine let out a high, tinkling laugh that grated on the ears. "Private. "Oh, my dear girl, nothing in this house is private. We know exactly what you are. A little London desperate stripping off her dignity to pay her daddy's gambling debts." Lumina turned slowly to face them. The exhaustion of the journey and the sheer terror of her situation burned away, leaving a cold, hard anger in its place. "My father made mistakes," Lumina said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But he never treated a guest in his home with such naked vulgarity. I may be poor, madame, but I know my place, and in 2 days my place will be at the head of this table." Rupert dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the fine china. He stood up, towering over her. The menace in his eyes was palpable. "Listen here, you little gold-digging tart," he hissed, leaning in close so she could smell the brandy on his breath at 9 in the morning. "Don't think a ring on your finger makes you safe. Archibald is practically a corpse already. When he kicks the bucket, you will be out on the moors faster than the scullery maids take out the ashes. You are a temporary inconvenience. Remember that." "Mr. Weatherby," Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her face a mask of disapproval. "His Grace is asking for Miss Kensington in the conservatory, immediately." Rupert sneered, stepping back. "Run along, nursemaid. Don't keep the master waiting." Lumina fled the room, shaking not with fear, but with adrenaline. Archibald had been right. This was a battlefield. The next 2 days were a blur of somber preparations. There was no joy, no flowers, no excited chatter. Mrs. Gable produced a wedding dress from an attic trunk. It had belonged to Archibald's mother. It was made of heavy ivory silk, yellowed with age, and smelling faintly of lavender and decay. It was too loose in the waist and too tight in the shoulders, fitting Lumina like a borrowed shroud. The wedding took place in the private chapel on the estate grounds. It was a damp stone building that hadn't seen regular use in years. Rain drummed relentlessly on the slate roof during the brief, joyless ceremony. Archibald looked worse than he had upon her arrival. He was wheeled into the chapel in an invalid chair, his face grey against the high, white collar of his dress shirt. He barely looked at Lumina during the vows, his raspy voice reciting the promises with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. Rupert and Catherine stood in the front pew, radiating hostility like heat from a furnace. Their presence was a reminder. We are watching. We are waiting. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the nervous vicar mumbled, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. There was no kiss. Archibald merely nodded a sharp jerk of his chin. "Done. Take me back to the house. The damp is getting into my lungs." As Lumina walked back down the aisle now, the Duchess of Harrogate, she felt a profound sense of finality. Lumina Kensington, the girl who loved botany and dreamed of travel, was dead. She was buried in that cold chapel. The wedding dinner was an excruciating affair. 4 people sat at a mahogany table meant for 20. The silence was punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and Rupert's occasional audible sighs of boredom. Archibald ate nothing, sipping only from a glass of thick, dark, medicinal wine. Lumina managed to swallow a few bites of roasted pheasant, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. Every time she looked up, she caught Catherine glaring at her wedding ring, a heavy, archaic thing, set with a blood-red ruby surrounded by diamonds. As the clock chimed 10, Archibald signalled to Mrs. Gable. "It is time," the Duke rasped. He looked at Lumina. For the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his remaining good eye. Was it pity or perhaps resignation? "Madame, if you would attend me in my chambers." Rupert let out a loud, grotesque snort into his wine glass. Catherine hid a smirk behind her napkin. The implication was clear, disgusting, and terrifying. Lumina's legs felt like lead as she stood up. She followed the Duke's wheelchair as the footman pushed it down the long corridor toward the master suite. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She thought of Lord Vane back in London, his greasy smile. She had traded one nightmare for another. The Duke's chambers were immense, dominated by a vast four-poster bed, hung with heavy green velvet curtains. A fire roared in the hearth, making the room stiflingly hot. The footman helped Archibald from the chair into a high-backed armchair by the fire, then bowed and left, closing the massive oak door with a thud that echoed like a prison sentence. They were alone. Lumina stood by the door, clutching her hands together, her knuckles white. She was wearing a silk nightgown Mrs. Gable had laid out for her, covered by a heavy robe. She felt sick with dread. Archibald watched her for a long moment, the firelight flickering over his scarred face, making him look grotesque. "Stop shaking, girl," he snapped, though there was no real heat in his voice. It just sounded tired. "You look like you're waiting for the hangman." I am trying to do my duty. Your Grace," she whispered, staring at the floor. Archibald let out that dry, hacking laugh again. "Duty? Yes. They all talk about duty." He leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. "Come here. Sit." He gestured to a small ottoman opposite his chair. Lumina approached cautiously and sat down, keeping her robe pulled tight around her. "Do you know why my nephew hates you so much, Lumina?" Archibald asked quietly, eyes still closed. "Because I have taken his inheritance." "No. Because he thinks you are going to give me an heir." Archibald opened his eyes and looked straight at her. "He thinks that tonight I am going to perform a miracle of biology and secure the succession, cutting him out entirely." Lumina blushed furiously, unable to speak. The Duke leaned forward, his expression intense. "Listen to me closely, Lumina. I am dying. My heart is failing, my lungs are rotting. The idea of me bedding you is not only grotesque, it is physically impossible. You are safe from me. Do you understand? Your virtue, such as it is, remains intact." Lumina let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her knees nearly buckled with relief. Tears pricked her eyes. "Then, why? Why marry me at all? Just to spite them?" Spite is a powerful motivator. "Yes, but I am a pragmatic man. I didn't just need a wife to annoy Rupert. I needed an accomplice." Archibald reached into the pocket of his dressing gown. His hand was shaking badly, but his grip was firm as he pulled something out. He held his hand out to her. Lying in his pale, liver-spotted palm was a key. It was small, made of heavy, tarnished iron, looking centuries old. "This," Archibald said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is your wedding gift." Lumina slowly reached out and took the key. It was cold and heavy. "What does it open?" "In my study behind the portrait of my grandfather, there is a wall safe. This is the only key. Rupert has spent 3 years trying to find it. He thinks it holds gold bullion, or perhaps the family jewels." Archibald smiled a grim, skeletal look. "It holds nothing of the sort. It holds ledgers. 5 years of them. Proof, Lumina. Proof that my dear nephew Rupert has been systematically embezzling from the estate since he took over management when I got sick. He's been gambling away the tenant rents in London, taking kickbacks from timber merchants, and he is currently in debt to some very dangerous men in the city for upward of £50,000. Lumina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 50,000. But that's a fortune. Indeed, if the creditors don't kill him, the courts will send him to prison for 20 years. Archibald's eyes glittered in the firelight. I have compiled the evidence, but if I use it now while I am alive, the scandal will destroy the family name, and frankly, I don't have the energy for the legal battle. He leaned forward, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. That is why I needed you. I needed someone with no loyalty to this family. Someone who knows what it is to be poor and desperate, and who hates men like Rupert who prey on the weak. I needed someone smart enough to understand the books and brave enough to pull the trigger when the time comes. Lumina stared at the key in her hand. It wasn't a gift of jewelry or wealth. It was a weapon. When I die, Archibald said fiercely, Rupert will try to throw you out within the hour. He will try to seize everything before the solicitors can arrive. You will take this key. You will open that safe, and you will present him with the choice. He ensures you receive your full widow's portion, which I have set up to include the dower house and a very comfortable income from the unentailed funds, or you hand those books to the magistrate. Lumina looked from the key to the dying old man. She realized then that he wasn't crazy. He was brilliant, and he was utterly ruthless. He had bought her, yes, but he was offering her a partnership. He was arming her against the vultures. Why trust me? Lumina whispered. I could take the key to Rupert tomorrow and cut a deal. You could, Archibald agreed. But you saw how he looked at you this morning. He doesn't want to cut a deal with you, Lumina. He wants to destroy you because you are beneath him. He will never respect you. I am offering you the means to force his respect. Lumina closed her fist tightly around the iron key. The metal bit into her skin. For the first time since her father died, she didn't feel like a victim floating in a storm. She felt an anchor catch. She looked up at the Duke and nodded slowly. Show me the books. Teach me what I need to know. Archibald nodded back, sinking into his chair, exhausted by his confession. Tomorrow. Tonight you sleep in the dressing room. Lock the door from the inside. We must maintain the illusion for now that we are a normal married couple. As Lumina lay on the cot in the dressing room that night, clutching the key beneath her pillow, she didn't weep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The prison she thought she had entered was actually a fortress, and she had just been handed the keys to the armory. The shift in Lumina was immediate. When she walked into the breakfast room the morning after the wedding, the air changed. She was no longer wearing her faded woolen dress. Mrs. Gable, seemingly approving of whatever had or hadn't happened in the Duke's chambers, had laid out one of the few new gowns Archibald had ordered, a deep emerald silk that matched the hard glint in Lumina's eyes. Rupert was already there, nursing a cup of black coffee, looking hungover. Catherine was absent. Rupert looked up, a sneer ready on his lips. Well, well. The blushing bride survives the night. Did Uncle Archie bore you to death with his war stories? Or did he just fall asleep before? That is enough, Rupert. Lumina's voice was low, but it carried the sharp crack of a whip. She didn't stop walking until she reached the head of the table, Archibald's chair. Rupert stared, fork halfway to his mouth. Excuse me. That is the Duke's seat. The Duke is indisposed this morning. As his wife, I will sit here. She pulled the heavy chair back and sat down, smoothing her silk skirts. She looked at the footman, who was gaping openly. Jenkins, fresh tea. And tell cook the eggs are cold. They are to be replaced immediately. Jenkins blinked, then snapped to attention. Yes, Your Grace. At once, Your Grace. Rupert slammed his cup down, coffee sloshing onto the linen. Who do you think you are talking to? You're a jumped-up little nobody." Lumina turned her gaze on him. It was a look she had borrowed from Archibald the night before, cold assessing and devoid of fear. "I am the Duchess of Harrogate Rupert, and in this house while my husband lives my word is law. If you cannot be civil at the breakfast table, you may eat in the stables with the horses whose company you seem to prefer." Rupert's jaw worked silently. He looked ready to leap across the table and throttle her. But something in her demeanor, the absolute certainty in her posture, perhaps bolstered by the iron key hidden in her pocket, stopped him. He scraped his chair back violently and stormed out of the room, muttering curses. Lumina picked up her teacup. Her hand was trembling slightly, but she forced herself to take a calm sip. The first skirmish was won. An hour later, she was in the library. The air was thick with the smell of Archibald's medicinal vaporizers. He was at his desk, surrounded by stacks of leather-bound ledgers. "I heard you threw Rupert out of the breakfast room." Archibald grunted without looking up. He was being unpleasant. I removed the unpleasantness. Archibald looked up, then a faint ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. "Good. You learn quickly. Sit down. We have work to do." Thus began Lumina's strange education. She had expected her married life to be one of quiet needlepoint and nursing duties. Instead, she became a student of forensic accounting. Archibald was a demanding teacher. He had no patience for slowness. He walked her through the complex estate accounts, showing her how the income flowed from the tenant farms, the timber mills in the North Woods, and the wool exports. "Look here." He would rasp his bony finger, jabbing at a column of figures dated 3 years prior. "The income from the Heisenberg mill. See the drop in Q3. Why?" Lumina frowned, studying the spidery handwriting. "The notation says, 'Machinery repairs due to fire damage.'" "Lies," Archibald spat. "There was no fire. I checked with the foreman myself 6 months later." Rupert pocketed £2,000 and wrote it off as a loss. He used it to pay a gambling debt at White's Club in London. Day after day they worked. Lumina's brain ached with numbers, but she found a strange satisfaction in it. It was a puzzle, a complex tapestry of deceit that Archibald had painstakingly unraveled. She began to see Rupert not just as a bully, but as a parasite bleeding the estate dry. They fell into a routine. Mornings were for estate management, afternoons for Archibald's rest, during which Lumina would read to him not poetry but history and political theory. He seemed to draw strength from hearing about battles and political maneuvering. Catherine tried to assert dominance in the household management, loudly complaining about menus and the dusting of the guest wings. Lumina, backed by a surprisingly cooperative Mrs. Gable, calmly countermanded every order. "We will not be opening the East Wing." "Catherine," Lumina said one afternoon in the hallway, stopping Catherine from haranguing a maid. "It is damp, and the expense of heating it is unnecessary when we have no guests." "I am a guest," Catherine shrieked, her face blotchy with rage. "You are family," Lumina corrected coolly. "And family makes sacrifices for the good of the estate. The East Wing remains closed." Catherine ran to Rupert, demanding he do something about that woman. But Rupert strangely had grown quieter. He watched Lumina with a new, unsettling intensity. He no longer saw her as an easy victim. He saw a threat that he couldn't quite define. He began spending more time away from the manor, riding out early, and returning late, smelling of cheap gin and agitation. One evening about a month after the wedding, Archibald collapsed in the library. A fit of coughing so violent it brought blood to his lips left him unconscious. Lumina, terrified, helped the footman carry him to his bed. The local doctor arrived, bled the Duke, administered laudanum, and shook his head grimly in the hallway. "It won't be long now, Your Grace," the doctor told Lumina. "A few weeks, perhaps less. His lungs are giving out." Lumina sat by Archibald's bedside all night. She held his cold, bony hand. Surprisingly, she found herself weeping, not for her lost dreams this time, but for this strange, hard man who had saved her from poverty and gifted her a spine of steel. They had formed an unlikely alliance in this cold house, a partnership born of necessity that had grown into a strange mutual respect. Around 3:00 a.m., Archibald stirred. His eyes opened cloudy and unfocused. "Lumina," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I am here, Archibald." He squeezed her hand weakly. "The vultures. They sense it. Rupert, be careful. He is cornered. A cornered rat bites." "I have the key," she whispered back fiercely. "Let them bite. I will bite back harder." Archibald closed his eyes, a look of peace settling over his ravaged face that she had never seen before. "Good girl," he breathed. "My good, brave girl." He drifted back into a laudanum sleep. Lumina looked toward the bedroom door. She knew that on the other side, down the dark corridor, Rupert was awake too, waiting for the silence that would signal his inheritance. The real battle was about to begin. Archibald Weatherby, the Duke of Harrogate, died on a Tuesday, just as the sun began to bleed through the heavy grey clouds over the moors. His passing was quiet, a final exhalation that sounded more like a sigh of relief than a death rattle. Lumina sat frozen in the chair beside the bed. She had not slept in 30 hours. Her hand was still wrapped around his, which was rapidly cooling. She felt a strange, hollowing grief. She had not loved him in the way poets wrote about. There was no flutter of romance. But she had loved him as a soldier, loves a general who saved them in the trenches. He had been her shield. Now the shield was gone. She barely had time to close his eyes before the door to the master suite banged open. It wasn't the doctor. It wasn't the vicar. It was Rupert. He stood in the doorway dressed in black, though he couldn't hide the triumphant flush on his cheeks. He looked at the bed, confirmed the stillness of the body, and then turned his gaze to Lumina. His eyes were bright, manic. "It's done then," Rupert said. He didn't whisper. "He's gone." "Show some respect," Lumina said, her voice hoarse. She stood up, her legs trembling from exhaustion. "He is barely cold." "He has been dead for years," Rupert scoffed, stepping into the room. "This is just the formality of the flesh catching up." He walked to the window and threw the heavy velvet curtains open, flooding the dim room with harsh morning light. "And now we clean house." He turned on his heel and pointed a finger at Lumina. "Get out." Lumina straightened her spine. She could feel the heavy iron key resting against her skin, hidden beneath her bodice on a silver chain. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. Get out of this room. Get out of this house. Pack your rags and go back to the gutter you crawled out of." "I am the Duchess of Harrogate," Lumina said, channeling every ounce of Archibald's icy demeanor she had absorbed over the past month. "This is my house. You are the nephew. You do not give orders here." Rupert laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound. "Duchess. You think that title sticks? I have already sent a rider to the magistrate. I am filing for an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation. We all know the old man couldn't perform. You are a virgin, Lumina, and a virgin widow is no widow at all in the eyes of the law if the marriage wasn't sealed. You are nothing." Lumina's blood ran cold. Archibald had warned her, but hearing it spoken with such venom was different. The law was tricky, and Rupert had money for bribes. The marriage was legal, she insisted, and until a judge says otherwise, I am the mistress of this estate. Now leave this room so the undertakers can do their work. Rupert's face darkened. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and grabbed Lumina by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. Listen to me, you little leech. I have tolerated your airs and graces because I had to, but the leash is off. I am the Duke now, and I say you are leaving. He dragged her toward the door. Lumina struggled, digging her heels into the carpet, but she was exhausted, and he was fueled by years of pent-up rage. He shoved her into the hallway. Catherine was standing there, arms crossed, smiling. Behind her were 2 burly groundskeepers who looked uncomfortable but unwilling to disobey Rupert. Escort Miss Kensington to the blue room, Rupert ordered the men. Lock the door. She stays there until the carriage arrives to take her back to London tomorrow morning. You cannot do this, Lumina screamed as the men grabbed her arms. I have rights. I need to speak to the solicitor. I need to see Mr. Holt. Mr. Holt has been dismissed, Rupert sneered. I have hired new counsel. Goodbye, Lumina. She was marched down the corridor away from Archibald's body, away from the library, and away from the safe. As the door to the blue room, a small dusty guest room in the west wing, was slammed and locked from the outside, Lumina realized the terrible truth. She had the key, but she had lost the castle. The blue room had no fireplace, and the chill of the Yorkshire evening seeped through the walls. Lumina sat on the edge of the stripped bed, shivering. She had checked the windows. They were 2 stories up, overlooking a sheer drop to the stone courtyard. Escape that way was suicide. She fingered the key around her neck. It felt heavy, mocking her. Archibald had given her the weapon, but he hadn't anticipated Rupert moving this fast. Rupert wasn't just grieving or greedy. He was prepared. Night fell. The house was silent save for the distant sounds of movement downstairs. Lumina knew what was happening. Rupert and Catherine were celebrating. They were likely tearing through the house, taking inventory of the silver, drinking the best wine. Around midnight, a soft scratching sound came from the door. Lumina froze. Who is there? Hush, your grace. It's Jenkins. The lock clicked. The door creaked open a fraction, revealing the young footman who had served her tea the morning she first disciplined Rupert. He held a candle in one hand and a ring of house keys in the other. His face was pale. Jenkins, Lumina breathed, rushing to the door. Why are you doing this? If Rupert finds out— Mr. Rupert is a bad man, ma'am, Jenkins whispered, looking over his shoulder. He sacked Mrs. Gable an hour ago. Threw her out in the rain, without her pension. We, the staff, we liked the old Duke. And we like you. You treated us fair. Loyalty. Archibald had ruled by fear, but Lumina had ruled by fairness. It was paying off. Where is he now? Lumina asked. In the library, with his new lawyer. They are drinking heavily. The library, Lumina murmured. That was where the safe was. It was madness to go there. But she had no choice. If she was sent away tomorrow, she would never get back inside. Jenkins, I need you to create a distraction. Can you do that? The boy swallowed hard, then nodded. The stables, I could let the hunters loose. Perfect. Do it. Give me 5 minutes. Jenkins vanished into the dark corridor. Lumina waited, counting the seconds. She took off her shoes, moving silently in her stocking feet. She crept down the servants' stairs, the shadows stretching long and terrifying against the walls. She reached the ground floor just as a shout went up from outside. "The horses! The damn horses are out! Catch them!" It was chaos. She heard heavy boots running across the hall, the front doors banging open. Rupert's voice was bellowing orders. Lumina slipped into the library. The room was thick with cigar smoke. A fire roared in the grate, dangerously high. On the desk, piles of papers were scattered Archibald's personal correspondence. Lumina didn't hesitate. She ran to the portrait of the grandfather above the mantelpiece. Her hands shook as she felt for the latch behind the frame. It clicked, and the heavy painting swung forward on hidden hinges. There it was, the steel face of the wall safe. She pulled the iron key from her neck. Her heart was hammering so loud she was sure it would wake the dead. She inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, heavy thunk. She pulled the door open. Inside were 5 thick leather ledgers, the black books. The proof of Rupert's embezzlement, his fraud, his theft. Lumina grabbed the first one. She had to get them out. She had to... "I wondered how long it would take you." Lumina spun around, dropping the ledger. Rupert was standing in the doorway. He wasn't outside chasing horses. He was leaning against the frame, a pistol in his hand. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You didn't really think I'd leave the room unguarded, did you?" Rupert stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. "I knew the old man was up to something. He spent too much time in here with you, plotting." He walked toward her, the gun lowered but ready. He looked at the open safe, then at the ledger on the floor. "So that's it? The big secret accounts?" He laughed, shaking his head. "I thought it was diamonds, maybe a new will. But books. These books prove you stole £50,000 from this estate." Lumina said, her voice trembling, but defiant. "They prove you are a criminal. If I take these to the magistrate, you won't be the Duke. You'll be a convict." Rupert stopped a few feet from her. He looked down at the ledger. Then he looked at the roaring fire. "You're right," he said softly. "They are dangerous, which is why it's a good thing accidents happen." He lunged. Lumina tried to dodge, but he was faster. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she cried out and shoved her backward. She stumbled, falling hard against the desk. Rupert scooped up the ledger from the floor. He grabbed the other 4 from the safe. "No!" Lumina screamed, scrambling up. Rupert threw the books into the fire. The dry paper, old and brittle, caught instantly. The flames licked up the leather spines. "There," Rupert said, watching the evidence of his crimes curl into ash. "No books, no proof, no crime." He turned to Lumina, his eyes dancing with madness. "And who are they going to believe, Lumina? The grieving nephew who just inherited the title, or the desperate, penniless gold digger who tried to blackmail him?" Lumina watched the books burn. She felt a wave of nausea. It was over. Archibald's work, his legacy, her protection, all turning to smoke up the chimney. Rupert holstered the pistol and poured himself another brandy. "Go back to your room, Lumina. If you behave, I might even give you a few pounds for the coach fare tomorrow. If not, well, the moors are full of deep bogs. People go missing all the time." Lumina stood there, staring at the fire. The tears finally came hot and stinging. She had failed. She turned to leave, defeated, her hand brushing against the pocket of her dress. Her fingers grazed the iron key she had put there after opening the safe. She paused. Archibald was a genius. He was paranoid. He was a man who played chess while everyone else played checkers. Lumina looked at the burning books. Then she looked at the key. Why was the key so heavy. The safe was a standard mechanism. A simple brass key would have sufficed, but this key was iron thick with a strange, complex head. And the safe had opened so easily, almost too easily, and she remembered something Archibald had said on their wedding night. In my study behind the portrait of my grandfather, there is a wall safe. But he had also said Rupert has spent 3 years trying to find it. Rupert had lived in this house his whole life. He knew where the safe was. Why would he have trouble finding it? Unless the safe behind the portrait wasn't the safe. Lumina looked at Rupert, who was drinking with his back to her, watching the flames. "You win, Rupert," she whispered. "I always do," he replied arrogantly. Lumina walked out of the library, but she didn't go upstairs. She ran to the wine cellar. Archibald had been a creature of habit. He didn't trust banks. He didn't trust lawyers. He trusted the foundations of his house. The key had a symbol etched into the iron bow, a small cluster of grapes. Lumina had thought it was just decoration. But now, in the desperate clarity of adrenaline, she realized it was a map. She reached the cellar damp and smelling of mold. She found the rack of vintage clarets, the dusty bottles that hadn't been touched in decades. She counted the rows. The symbol on the key had 5 grapes, row 5. She pushed aside a crate. Behind it, set into the rough stone of the foundation, was a keyhole. Not a safe door, just a keyhole in the rock. She inserted the iron key. It fit perfectly. She turned it. A section of the stone wall, no larger than a shoebox, clicked and popped open. It was a pneumatic tube system, an old Victorian installation used for sending messages between large estates long since sealed over. Inside was not a ledger. Inside was a single sealed envelope addressed to the High Court of Chancery, to be opened upon my death. And underneath it, a small velvet bag. Lumina opened the bag. Diamonds. Not just a few a fortune in uncut stones. But the letter. The letter was the real weapon. Lumina broke the seal. She had to know. It wasn't just accounting. It was a confession. Archibald hadn't just recorded for He had recorded his own. He had liquidated the liquid assets of the estate, nearly £1 million in gold and bonds, years ago, before Rupert could touch them. He had hidden the money in a trust that only activated upon the presentation of this letter, and the sole beneficiary of the trust, Lumina Kensington. But there was a clause, a trap. If this letter is presented, the title and the land which are entailed pass to Rupert Weatherby. However, the entirety of the Harrogate fortune is severed from the title. Rupert will inherit the house, the debts, and the crumbling walls. He will be a duke of nothing but dust. Lumina Kensington shall inherit the wealth on the condition that she uses 1% of it to purchase the mortgage of the Harrogate estate, effectively becoming Rupert's landlord. Lumina stared at the paper. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. Rupert had burned the ledgers that would have sent him to prison. He had saved himself from jail. But Archibald had condemned him to something Rupert would hate far more. He had condemned him to poverty, and he had made Lumina his master. First gift, Lumina whispered into the darkness of the cellar. He said the key was the wedding gift. She clutched the letter and the diamonds to her chest. Upstairs, she could hear Rupert shouting for more wine. He thought he was the king of the castle. He didn't realize he was just the squatter. Lumina pocketed the letter. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. Tomorrow was the funeral. All the local gentry would be there. The magistrate would be there. That was when she would give Rupert his gift. The day of the funeral was a black, weeping affair. Rain turned the churchyard into a slick mire as the local gentry gathered eager to witness the final act of the Harrogate scandal. Rupert stood by the open grave, the picture of solemn grief, though a triumphant smirk tugged at his lips. As the first shovel of earth hit the coffin, he raised a hand to address the crowd. "My friends," Rupert boomed, "thank you for bidding farewell to my uncle. As the new Duke, I invite you back to the manor. However," he paused, turning his cold eyes onto Lumina, "the Dowager Duchess will not be joining us. She has urgent business in London." A ripple of shock went through the mourners. Eviction at the graveside. "I am going nowhere." "Rupert." Lumina's voice cut through the rain like a bell. She stepped forward, boots squelching in the mud, and lifted her heavy black veil. Her eyes were dry and dangerous. "This is not the place for squabbles," Sir Thomas the magistrate interjected nervously. "This is not a squabble," Lumina said, pulling a sealed envelope from her coat. "It is a legal proceeding." She held up the letter she had found in the wine cellar. The red wax seal stamped with the ducal crest was unbroken. "My late husband anticipated his nephew's impatience. He left this in my care. A codicil to be opened only after his burial." Rupert scoffed. "Another forgery. The estate is entailed, you foolish girl. The land, the house, the title, they are mine by blood. No paper changes that." "You are right," Lumina replied, her voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. "The title is yours. The house is yours. But the rest—" She handed the envelope to the magistrate. "Read it, Sir Thomas. The section regarding the Harrogate Trust." Sir Thomas broke the seal. As he read, his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "It appears," he stammered, "that the late Duke liquidated the family's entire investment portfolio 5 years ago." "Impossible," Rupert shouted. "I've seen the books. The accounts you saw were creative fictions," Lumina said smoothly. "Decoys to keep a thief busy." Sir Thomas continued. "The assets totaling £900,000 were placed into a blind trust. The sole beneficiary is Mrs. Lumina Weatherby." The silence was absolute. £900,000. "However," Sir Thomas read on, voice shaking, "there is a condition. The beneficiary must use a portion of these funds to purchase the outstanding mortgages of the Harrogate estate." Rupert's face drained of colour. "I don't understand." Lumina stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "It means, Rupert, that while you are the Duke, you are penniless. You own the title, but I own the debt." She smiled a sharp, terrifying expression. "I hold the mortgage on the manor. I hold your debts to the timber merchants. I hold your gambling notes from London. Archibald bought them all." Rupert staggered back. You can't." "I can. And I will. You burned the ledgers that would have sent you to prison, Rupert. You saved yourself from jail, but you condemned yourself to this. You are the Duke of Harrogate, yes. But I am your landlord." She turned to the stunned crowd. "His Grace has agreed to allow me to reside in the Dower House indefinitely. In exchange, I shall not foreclose, provided the rent is paid on time." She looked back at Rupert, who was trembling with impotent rage. "The first payment yet is due on the 1st of the month, Your Grace. I suggest you sell the horses." Lumina turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She could feel the stares of the county on her back, not with pity, but with awe. 6 months later. The Dower House was a sun-drenched sanctuary. Lumina sat in the conservatory, painting a watercolor of a rare orchid. She looked 5 years younger than the girl who had been auctioned off in London. The door opened, and Mrs. Gable entered. She had been rehired the day after the funeral, along with the rest of the staff Rupert had tried to sack. "A letter, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said. Lumina glanced at the scratching, desperate scrawl. It was from Rupert. "Regarding the roof repairs, the winter has been harsh. I beg for an extension on the quarter's interest." Lumina sighed and dipped her brush in crimson water. "Is there a reply, ma'am?" "No reply," Lumina said calmly, returning to her painting. "Let him wait. It builds character." She looked out the window toward the brooding stone hulk of Harrogate Manor on the hill. It was a prison no longer. It was just a house, and she held the key. Archibald had been right. He hadn't given her a fairy tale. He had given her something far more enduring. He had given her the power to write her own story. And so Lumina Kensington didn't just survive the game of aristocrats. She won it. She walked into a cage and forged it into a kingdom. Archibald's wedding gift wasn't just the key, but the freedom it unlocked, proving that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, but owning them. I hope you enjoyed this original historical drama. If Lumina's victory gave you chills, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done? Would you have evicted Rupert, or was making him a tenant? The ultimate punishment. Let me know in the comments. And for more stories of romance, betrayal, and sweet justice, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Until next time, keep dreaming.